Hello everyone. Today, we're going to tell 3 true horror stories about our neighbors. I'm currently in a predicament, and quite frankly, I don't know what to do. I'll start from the beginning. 5 years ago, my next-door neighbor, Charlie or Charles as we call him, informed us of his 14-year-old son's disappearance. He reported it to the police. It was on the news. It was everywhere. Me and my wife felt absolutely awful and always offered to help them out in any way we could. As the years passed with no word of their son, we assumed they eventually came to terms with it and realized the worst had probably happened. Me and my wife never had the nerve to ask if the body ever turned up. Occasionally, Charles and his wife would invite me and my wife over for a BBQ during the warmer months. We noticed neither of the two were ever the same since their son had gone missing. Charles' wife, Kathy, was always quieter and more reserved, and Charles just seemed more awkward and nervous, both understandable to a certain extent. Fast forward a couple of years later to just last week. Charles came over to me when I was taking out the garbage and asked to borrow a shovel. Without hesitation, I ran to get him my best shovel, not asking why he needed it. He thanked me and said he just had to do some work in his backyard, and he'd get it back to me by tomorrow. He then disappeared into his backyard. I went inside, and when I was by one of my upstairs windows that has a clear view into Charlie's backyard, I could see he was digging out a really big hole in the grounds. He seemed to be struggling a bit. He's 56 after all. I figured I'd go grab my second shovel and help him out. As I entered his backyard and called his name, he looked up from what he was doing, dropped my shovel and hurried over to me, saying no. No, it's okay time. I got it. Please just leave. I said, what's wrong with you? It's not a big deal. Mainly because of his bizarre reaction. He told me I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard, and then pointed to the gate as if I were a dog. I was so taken aback by how he was acting that I just left without saying another word. I went upstairs to spy on him through the window. He was digging the hole for at least another half hour. When it finally looked like he was done, he started looking around like up high at neighboring houses, as if to check and make sure nobody was watching. And then before I could think to hide, he spotted me at my window. All I could do at that point was casually walk away. He's up to something, and I wanted to find out what. I continued to look at his backyard every so often, but he wasn't digging anymore. I figured he knew I was watching now and would wait until it was dark out, and I was exactly right. At 1:30 in the morning, I heard the sound of a shovel hitting the dirt outside. It was too dark to see anything from my window now, so I snuck outside quietly and looked over the fence in the backyard. I could see him digging loud and clear. Now, when he went inside his house, I took that opportunity to sneak into his backyard and take a look at what was in the hole he was digging. The moonlight alone revealed a small piece of a black garbage bag protruding from the dirt at the bottom of the hole. I looked at his back door and back at the hole. I did this 3 more times, deciding whether or not to see what was in the bag. In the end, I decided to run back to my backyard, and it was a good thing I did, because he came back outside seconds later. But he wasn't digging. In fact, he disappeared to the other side of his house and didn't come back. I went back into my house and quietly got back into bed, trying not to wake up my wife. The next day, the first thing I did was look out my window to see that the hole in the ground was completely patched up in Charles' backyard. I also noticed that his SUV was parked in the street now instead of his driveway. I don't know what happened throughout the rest of that night, but I'm disturbed to think that what was at the bottom of that hole might have been his son's body. For all I know, he dug up that hole to remove whatever he had previously buried down there and drive it somewhere else to dump it. This is all speculation. Call me crazy if you want. I haven't told anyone, not even my wife, and quite frankly, I don't know what to do. Charles never gave me back my shovel. I'm not going to ask him for it. In fact, he's been avoiding me ever since. and something disturbing happened. Yesterday, I, by coincidence, happened to look out my window across to Charlie's house and caught him standing at one of his windows, looking into mine. When he saw me, he shut his blinds, and that was in the middle of the day. I have no idea what to do, but I'm honestly terrified. When I was around 13, my family and I moved into an old house. It was at least 90 years old and remained in pristine condition for all of these years. The house itself was nice, but the inside gave you that unsettling feeling due to its antique design. It was bothersome, but I sucked it up and decided to give the new home a chance. Everything about the neighborhood seemed okay. The people were nice and didn't have much commotion, which is what my parents were looking for. During the first week, one of our neighbors had brought over some cookies as a welcome to the neighborhood. She was this old, petite Cuban woman who had the personality of a teddy bear. In other words, she was nice and was willing to help any way she could. Her name was Maria and claimed to have moved here just a few months prior to our arrival. She had told us about the history of the neighborhood, some of the rules, and seems she knew a lot about it. One day, she had to come over to the house to tell my parents more about the neighborhood. For some reason, they felt sort of uncomfortable around her, like she was nice, but she was one of those people who overstayed their welcome. My parents weren't the type to assume, but something was just off about her. Fast forward about a month later, my parents had gone out for a work company event. I was home alone with one of my friends from school playing video games when we hear a noise from outside. Now, in order to understand this next part, you need to understand the layout of my house. My room is on the second floor, so when you look out my window, you could see into the backyard of the next house. The noise was similar to someone spray painting a wall or something. We look outside to see that my theory was semi-correct. The woman who was my neighbor is using a water hose spraying something on the concrete. It was around 6:00 p.m. and was somewhat dark out, but I was still able to see that whatever she was spraying appeared to be a red liquid. We watch for a good while as she begins to clean and sanitize the concrete. When she looks up at my window, we immediately duck down, shitting her pants and hoping she didn't see us. Thankfully, she didn't come to the door or confront us in any way. However, we were still suspicious about her intentions and told my parents about it. At first, they thought I was telling them one of my stories, as I was known to lie here and there. But when they found out I wasn't lying, they called the police just to be sure. After about a week of law enforcement investigating her, we then learned a harsh truth. As it turns out, the red liquid we had seen was blood. She had murdered her husband for reasons I won't go into. But to put it simply, she couldn't take him anymore. Police had also found several drawn pictures of her husband on her walls to use as some sort of trophy. She, of course, was arrested and put in jail for, I assumed. What was the rest of her life? We had only known her for a little over a month, and we were shocked to learn what had happened. What had once been this friendly neighbor only turned out to be a monster behind closed doors. This is a story about my strange experiences with an old neighbor. It all started about 5 years ago. I moved into a standard house in what I thought was a really nice neighborhood. And it was, for the most part, everybody that I met around my street was really nice. But my next door neighbor to the west I never met. From the time I moved in, I would rarely see anybody outside on his property, and things around the yard were really simple. Still, I knew that somebody lived there because there was always a car in the driveway. But overall, I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to what my neighbors were doing. One day though, I was outside getting my mail. After I got the mail from the mailbox and was starting to walk back up the driveway, I noticed my next door neighbor. He was standing at one of his front windows of his house and was just staring at me. He appeared to be looking right at me, almost glaring. It was really awkward, and I looked away into the letters of mail that I had in my hands. But after traveling a few steps up my driveway, I had to look again. He was still looking at me, and he almost looked angry. I smiled and waved at him. I kind of expected him to at least wave back a little, but he just kept staring at me as I walked all the way to my house. That was a really strange first interaction with my next-door neighbor, I thought. It had already been about 6 months since I moved in, and this is the first time that I had seen him. I thought that the guy must just be really unfriendly, or he was just weird, or maybe he disliked me for some reason, although I had no idea why he would dislike me. It's not like I played loud music or had parties at my house. I couldn't think of any reason why it didn't really bother me too much, though. Sometimes people are unfriendly. What are you going to do? Probably about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks went by since I had first seen my neighbor before I saw him again. The next time I saw him was when I was getting home one night. It was like 10, 0 p.m. and dark out. I saw my neighbor standing at his window again, staring at me, just like the previous time I saw him as I got out of my car. And then I didn't look at him again until I was at my front door. When I looked back, he was still staring at me. That was only the second time that I noticed him, but he sure seemed strange to me. After going inside, I went to bed maybe an hour later. I woke up in the middle of the night though. I just remember that when I woke up, I was really thirsty, and it was almost 4:00 a.m. Occasionally, I wake up in the night really dehydrated, and then I just drink some water and go back to sleep. This night, I didn't have any water in my bedroom, so I got up to go to the kitchen. When I was on my way there, I passed by the living room window. My neighbor was standing in my front yard, staring right into my window. It was the same stare that he always had, and he was maybe 10 feet away from the window. I will never forget the feeling of shock that I had when I saw him. It was terrifying. I ran out of sight of the window. When I got to my kitchen, I remember that I was pacing around, wondering what on earth my neighbor was doing. After a couple of minutes, I felt better. I got some water and decided to go back and see if my neighbor was still there. When I returned, he was gone. I walked around every window of my house looking outside, but I didn't see my neighbor at all anymore. After that, I went back to sleep, although it took me a while. The next day, I was still thinking about it and decided that I was going to go over and talk to my neighbor. I really didn't want to, but at the same time, I felt that I should. When I walked into his front yard, he was not looking out of the window or staring at me. I knocked on his door and he didn't answer at first. The car was in his driveway though, so I knew that he was home. I stayed on the front step and rang the doorbell this time. Finally, the door opened. I saw my neighbor, the same guy who'd been looking into my window the previous night. I smiled and offered out my hand for him to shake, and I introduced myself. He didn't shake my hand though, and just asked me what I wanted. I told him that I thought I saw him in my front yard the previous night, and I was wondering what he was doing. He denied it, cursed at me, and then slammed the door in my face. I walked back to my house. I only saw him one other time about a month after this took place. I saw a moving truck in his driveway and moving guys loading up some furniture. I saw my neighbor with him as well, and I gathered that he was moving. I can't say that I miss him at all, but I'm still left with questions about what he was doing. I also wonder if that's the only time he stared into my windows.